Hello guys, I'm Tom, and today we're going to discover what Dead Horse is. One of the most disturbing and symbolic creatures in recent animated horror was born from the mind of Ruby Taylor, a director who, at the end of 2022, shocked the world with a short film as unsettling as it is unforgettable, Dead Horse. This work was released during the cold and gloomy month of November, a perfect time for a story that doesn't aim to entertain in the traditional sense, but rather to discomfort, fascinate, and leave a lasting emotional imprint on the minds of those who dare to watch it. The story takes us into a dense and silent forest, where a gray wolf wanders alone, burdened by a palpable sadness. Amid that desolate landscape, he encounters an impossible creature, the deformed and reanimated corpse of a horse. But this isn't simply an animated monster. It is a living metaphor, a visual representation of grief, trauma, and the forced transformation endured by those who face loss or abandonment. What begins as a surreal scene quickly transforms into a symbolic and sensory experience, where the oppressive atmosphere, the distressing sound design, and the raw animation combine to tell a profound story, one that needs no dialogue. That's why, in this video, I'll explain in detail the story and origins of Dead Horse. I'll give you a full summary of what happens in the short film. We'll analyze the symbolism behind its narrative, its dark atmosphere, and of course, we'll talk about the creature, its physical appearance, behavior, possible interpretations, and what it truly represents within this haunting story. The story begins in a setting that feels ripped from a dark tale by the Brothers Grimm, a deep forest covered in a blanket of damp shadows, where the wind doesn't blow and light barely touches the ground. Suddenly, a dark-furred deer bursts through the trees, running desperately as if fleeing not just from death, but from a much older and more terrifying threat. Chasing after it are two wolves, one with grayish fur speckled with white spots that glimmer like frost, and another with a darker, almost coal-black coat, moving with stealth and precision. A crow watches them from high in a tree, motionless at first, then lets out a caw that cuts through the air like a warning, like a funeral bell signaling that something unnatural is drawing near. The chase intensifies. The wolves split up as part of an instinctive choreography. The gray wolf flanks one side, while his darker companion advances from the other. The deer, in its desperation, leaps gracefully over a stream, closely followed by the gray wolf. The dark wolf, however, dives into the dense undergrowth, venturing into the very heart of darkness. And it's at that precise moment when the logic of the world begins to break. A dissonant sound of unknown origin tears through the surroundings like a crack in reality. It doesn't resemble any natural noise. It's not the growl of a predator, nor the crunch of twigs underfoot. It's a dense vibration, almost alien, seemingly emanating from the deepest part of the forest, from a place where light doesn't reach and time doesn't flow as it should. The gray wolf stops abruptly. He knows, feels it in his bones, that something is terribly wrong. Fear becomes tangible, thick like fog. Then, the unimaginable happens. A gigantic figure, hidden until now, begins to reveal its form. What seemed like a rotting tree trunk turns out to be a limb, a colossal leg, covered in blood and shadow. The gray wolf watches in horror as his companion, still unaware of what's coming, continues to move forward. But there's no time for warnings. Suddenly, an invisible claw, impossibly large, lunges at the dark wolf. It grabs him with inhuman force. What follows is a brutal, precise sequence. The wolf's body is torn apart, skinned, turned into a mass of wet, red bones. There are no screams, only the sound of flesh being separated from bone with surgical precision. The lifeless body falls to the ground, but it doesn't stay that way for long. Some unknown force, reanimates it. From its empty sockets, emerge two small white eyes that shine like beacons in the gloom. The skeleton mutates, reorganizes, transforms. What was once a wolf is now becoming a horse-shaped creature, but not one we've ever seen before. Its silhouette is unnatural. Its proportions don't match any living beast. It has no skin, yet its bony structure bleeds and pulses. It's as if it still carries the echo of its previous form's suffering. This being, a fusion of pain and grotesque rebirth, fixes its gaze on the gray wolf and lets out an ancestral roar, a sound that's not only heard but felt deep in the chest. Then, in an act as savage as it is symbolic, it pounces on an innocent rabbit passing nearby. It devours it with profane ferocity, leaving behind a pile of gnawed bones, with strips of skin dangling like putrid trophies. The gray wolf, paralyzed, stares at the horror and begins to lose grip on his sanity. But the worst is yet to come. From deep within the forest, more eyes begin to glow. Tiny white dots watch him from the darkness, as if the forest itself had gained awareness. Panic overtakes him. He runs like never before, driven by the most primal instinct to survive. When he finally stops, exhausted and gasping, thinking he might have escaped, he hears the crows caw once more. Turning around, he sees that the bird has also been transformed. Its glowing red skeleton stares back at him with a sinister aura, as if it, too, now belonged to that dark cult. And then he sees it. From the center of a black, mist-covered lake, a colossal figure emerges. Its body appears to be made of solid smoke, like a shadow given physical form. At its top rises an enormous, white, immaculate horse skull, floating, needing no muscle or tendon to hold it aloft. The creature looms without moving, and yet its very presence exerts a suffocating pressure. Without touching him, without uttering a word, the entity seizes him. An invisible force begins acting on his body. The wolf feels his bones vibrate, something inside him trying to escape. And just when it seems like there's no salvation, more appear. Other skeletal horses, all with blood-red bones, surround him in complete silence, like members of an ancient ritual. In one of the most unexpected and emotionally devastating moments of the entire short film, the story takes a turn that changes everything. The gray wolf, paralyzed before the monstrous and overwhelming presence of dead horse, finds itself at the edge of the abyss, trapped between despair and the deepest fear. At that moment, it lets out a howl that is not simply a cry for help, but a heartbreaking and meaningful plea, a lament filled with pain, loss, and a nostalgia that transcends the physical. It is a sound that pierces the dense and oppressive silence of the forest, a cry that penetrates the fragile barrier between the soul and the curse that threatens to devour it. And then, the impossible happens. That howl, born from an ancient and profound bond between two beings who once shared the freedom and harmony of the forest, awakens something dormant in the very heart of the creature. Inside the equine skeleton, the abomination into which his wolf companion was transformed, an unexpected reaction begins to occur. The empty, dark eyes of the beast, which until then had been nothing more than lifeless pits, slowly dilate and turn a pure, unsettling white, as if a flash of consciousness pierced the darkness that dominated them. In a sudden outburst filled with fury, a mixture of violence, and a sort of belated redemption, the animated skeleton lunges at dead horse. With desperate strength, it sinks its jaws into one of the grotesque, dark limbs of the creature, managing to tear off a piece of that cursed flesh that seemed impenetrable. This act of defiance, of rebellious fury, interrupts for the first time the seemingly unbreakable cycle of terror. For a fleeting moment, the gray wolf sees his friend, who until that moment seemed lost forever in the darkness, transform despair into hope. But that spark of rebellion does not remain an isolated or lonely gesture. The unthinkable takes shape. The other transformed creatures, the rabbit and the crow, both reduced to skeletal, corrupted, and distorted forms, also rise, inspired by that flare of resistance. They attack Dead Horse with contained rage, a fury repressed by having been torn from their original natures. They bite it, assault it relentlessly, tearing fragments from its dark body with such unexpected ferocity that the entity itself seems unable to anticipate or counter this insurrection. For the first time in the entire story, Dead Horse is not the absolute predator, but a creature surprised and overwhelmed by the betrayal and revolt of its own servants. Wounded, weakened, and overwhelmed by an uprising it never imagined, Dead Horse has no choice but to retreat. Bleeding darkness, it drags itself painfully toward the waters of the nearby lake, that black, still mirror that seems like a portal to another world. Without uttering a final roar or offering resistance, the creature slowly submerges into the depths, disappearing into the liquid shadows that engulf it, swallowed by the same shadowy abyss from which it once emerged. What remains afterward is a sacred, almost reverential silence. The gray wolf, exhausted and marked by terror, watches the still lake under the pale, cold light of the moon. Beside him, his former friend approaches, still in skeletal form, but clearly free from the dark influence that once dominated him. Under that faint glow, both raise their heads in unison and release one last howl. It is not a cry of victory or joy, but a mourning song, a mutual recognition of shared suffering, and a faint, almost imperceptible hope that within the deepest abyss something of humanity may persist. Thus concludes the short film, leaving the viewer with a complex mix of emotions: horror, compassion, and a strange sense of peace, that peace born from the understanding that, even in the absolute darkness, light can break through. Now, after having explored every corner of this unsettling story, it is time to focus on the true epicenter of terror, the creature that gives the short film its name, Dead Horse. Visually, its presence is overwhelming and imposing. It appears as a colossal entity, a form vaguely resembling a quadruped, but one that has been deformed by indescribable and malevolent forces. Its legs, similar to those of a horse, seem to merge with the forest, as if it were itself a living extension of the dark and damp landscape it inhabits. However, what really stands out, and provokes a visceral fear, are its arms. Elongated, muscular limbs ending in human-like hands with 5 fingers sharp as blades, capable of tearing both flesh and, it seems, the very fabric of reality. And its head is an image that refuses to leave the mind. A horse skull of exaggerated proportions, completely white and stripped of any sign of life, disproportionate and impossible to ignore. Its silhouette evokes echoes of iconic monsters, like the skullcrawlers from Godzilla vs. Kong. But here, the terror becomes more intimate, more personal. It is not just a giant monster. It is an oppressive presence that tightens the chest and chills the blood merely by existing. Dead Horse does not limit itself to wandering the forest. It moves fluidly through rivers and lakes as well, as if water were a natural extension of its shadowy domain. Its territory is not a fixed space, but anywhere the light does not reach, where cold and dampness reign, and where life seems to have stopped. It does not hunt out of hunger or necessity. It simply attacks, driven by instinct or some incomprehensible will. Its first encounter with the wolf is a clear example of this violence without sense or apparent logic, an act of pure, cold destruction. But the most terrifying aspect is not its size or brutality, but its supernatural ability to rip the skeleton from any living being, mold it, and turn it into a servant, a bone specter animated by a residual spark of what it once was. These skeletons are not mere automatons. They obey with a disturbing mix of submission and violence. They attack cruelly, dismember their victims with macabre precision, and once the flesh has been removed, their bones reconfigure into new forms that perpetuate the cycle. An expanding army, a legion of bony monsters reflecting death and absolute submission. But why does it do this? What does it gain by creating these servants? Is it pure evil? Or is there a deeper intention? Although its acts seem born of chaos and destruction, there is one detail that completely changes the analysis. These skeletons do not entirely lose their original identity. They retain something intangible, a reflection of their past consciousness, a shadow of their former selves. This would explain why the transformed wolf manages to rebel. His friend's howl not only activates an automatic mechanism, but awakens a memory, an emotion, a deep connection. The same happens with the crow and the rabbit. They are not mere puppets. They are conscious victims trapped between two worlds, between what they were and what the monster forces them to become. And it is precisely in that delicate balance where the story gains even greater complexity. Ruby Taylor, the creator behind this animated nightmare, has not revealed details about Dead Horse's origin. There are no public statements or official clues, which has opened the door to multiple interpretations and theories among fans and critics. The first theory suggests that Dead Horse is a shaman or dark witch, a being who, through ancient rituals, managed to transform their body and merge with the forest. A modern skinwalker, a mythological figure that crosses the boundary between human and animal, controlling the forest inhabitants and transforming them into tortured extensions of their will. The second, more symbolic and emotional theory proposes that Dead Horse is not an individual creature, but a collective consciousness, the sum of all the pain, suffering, and violent deaths that have occurred in the forest over centuries. An entity born from the shared trauma of massacred animals, a force embodying the justice or vengeance of all those forgotten souls. That is why it does not chase the deer at the start, but goes straight for the wolves. It represents retaliation, a force born from accumulated resentment. However, even an entity created by suffering can become corrupted, and that is exactly what happens. In its thirst for revenge, Dead Horse becomes what it once hated, an indiscriminate executioner who attacks without distinction, even innocents like the rabbit and the crow. Thus, what was born as justice ends up transforming into yet another form of horror. And perhaps that is the deepest and most disturbing tragedy of the short film.